3, 2, 1. Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Gelobet Seist du Jesu Christ, which translates to Praised be you, Jesus Christ. This is a pretty interesting chorale. I think that there's like some quasi-modality going on. Nothing really here to prove it like from a harmonic standpoint, but there's just something about the fact that A plays a very prevalent role, but we're in a very D-centric pitch collection, so maybe there's like some A mixolydian vibes going on here. But all in all, we're just going to hop right into the analysis. There's some interesting modulation as well. 2 sharps in the key signature. We start on A, we end on A, but I do think we're in the key of D major, and we just start with a 5 chord, passing 7th in the bass, F sharp, C sharp, F sharp, and A with the passing 7th in the bass. That's a 3 chord, kind of an unusual progression here, 5 going to 3. That's a take on a deceptive progression. And then we get D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our tonic triad. Part of the reason kind of why it feels like A here, if this was a G sharp maybe, this would be like a 1, 6, 4 progression, which for some reason seems a little bit more normative to me. I don't know, maybe I'm just making that up. But then we have C sharp here, which is a passing 7th, and E here, which is a passing tone, before we go to G, B, D, and B, which is G major in root position, our 4 chord. This E is a non-chord tone, this G is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we get G, C sharp, E, and A, which is 5, 4, 2, A7 over G. And then we get E and C sharp. Actually, those are both chord tones. I'm not going to mark those. But this F sharp is a non-chord tone here. Very brief, very just, fleeting, decorative. And then we get F sharp, A, and D, which is our tonic triad in first inversion, 1, 6. 5, 4, 2 wants to go to 1, 6, so it's a good thing that we have this resolution happening here. This F sharp and E really is just purely decorative. This D is a chord tone, this D is a chord tone, and this G is a non-chord tone, but it's kind of like the chords being put in root position here. We have 3 Ds and an F sharp. Then we have A, D, G, and E. This D is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, and when the resolution happens, the 7th of the chord gets removed. We have A, C sharp, E, and E, which is just our 5 chord A major, and our perfect authentic cadence is concluded with D major, D, A, F sharp, and D, which is our tonic triad in root position. Looking ahead, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A major, and I think for the most part, actually, no, we do have a bit of a zone here. We do avoid G's in general here, so that we don't really know the difference between D major and A major. So we have a bit of a nebulous sort of modulation zone where the modulation could really occur anywhere. But I'm going to make the argument that we stay in the key of D at least for the first couple of chords. We start the phrase off with F sharp, A, and C sharp, which is our 3 chord. F sharp's major with, F sharp minor. I was going to say F sharp 7 because I was marking that passing 7th here in the bass. This D is also a passing tone before we get D, E, A, and E, but I think this D is an accented non-chord tone, and we get C sharp, E, A, and E, which is 5, 6. Interestingly, we have 5, 3, 1 here, and here we have 1, 3, 5. Maybe there's something significant about that. I don't know. But I think this A major chord over C sharp is where we modulate to the key of A major, and this is our 1, 6 chord in the key of A. So after our 1, 6 chord, we have B, D, D, and F sharp, which is B minor in root position. That's our 2 chord. This C sharp is a passing tone. This A is a non-chord tone, it's a 7th, and then we get G sharp, E, B, and E, which is our 5, 6 chord. 2 going to 5 is a good sign. This E is a chord tone, this D is a passing 7th, and then we get A, E, B, and C sharp, which makes us feel like we're going to resolve to A major, which is what we would expect after our 5 chord, but this B is a 9/8 suspension over the bass, and by the time the resolution occurs on the 8th note of that beat, we get F sharp in the bass and F sharp in the tenor. F sharp, A, and C sharp. I reckon this E is also I think there's a term for a suspension that resolves upwards, but I can't remember it right now. But this I think is actually an F sharp minor chord, which would be 6, so deceptive progression that prolongs the resolution. We then have D, F sharp, A, and B, which is B minor 7 over D, 2-6-5. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords. Then we have E, G sharp, and B with a passing 7th going on here. This is a 5 chord happening off of the harmonic rhythm, but completing our perfect authentic cadence in the key of A, C sharp, E, and A. Or rather, A major is completing our perfect authentic cadence in the key of A. So looking ahead here, we actually have a very harmonically active phrase, at least in the way that I look at it. This beginning here sounds like it's in the key of D major, and then we move right back to the key of A major. But then again, you know, what could be happening here is a brief stint of A mixolydian. If you hear this entire phrase in the key of A major, which I think would be kind of hard to do because the melody is very clearly in D major, right? We have 5 going to 1, very much solidifying the key of D major here, then leading tone D major. It's a very D major centric melody, and then we go right back to G sharp afterwards. So I think there's a very fleeting reference to D major, but not quite fleeting enough to just be a tonicization. So I do think this A major chord is our gateway back to D. Very briefly, we do go to D major, D, A, F sharp, and A, which is our tonic triad. E and G here kind of gives us a passing 5-7 chord, E, A, G, and A, but without the third of the chord, I'm not sure how strong of an analysis this is. But regardless, we do get taken to D major in first inversion afterwards, F sharp, A, and D, so we'll just change the figured bass. And when I said fleeting, I really did mean fleeting. I do think we're going right back to the key of A major again, which is very interesting. D major is going to turn into 4-6. G sharp's a passing tone, E's an anticipation, this B is going to turn it into some sort of suspension. But we have G sharp, E, B, and D here, which is 5-6-5, E7 over G sharp. And then we have A major, A, E, B, and C sharp, but the resolution happens on the next beat. But we know that Bach is basically implying a tonic triad here, even though the B gets replaced in the bass by the time the A resolves. Actually, what ends up happening here is we get B, E, I guess this A becomes a non-chord tone as well, along with D, which is also a passing tone. And I guess this G sharp is a non-chord tone as well, based on the way that we look at it. Not erase this A, because this A is part of the A chord that's being implied. But we have B, E, G sharp, and D, which is 5-4-3, E7 over B. With counterpoint going on, it's hard sometimes to line up all of the beats, but the chords are definitely being implied here. I don't think I have to stretch too far outside of the grid lines to find the chords, but it is a little bit of a stretch. But after our 5-4-3 chord, we do go to our tonic, A major, C sharp, E, A, and E, first inversion. So we're seeing some similar ideas here where we have 1 going to 1-6 and it's being separated by a chord. This very easily could have been a C sharp diminished chord if one of the voices allowed itself to be a C sharp, because we have the E and we have the G, which is 2/3 of the chord. We just need the root, and that's typically what we would expect, not suspect. We would expect to be between a tonic triad and a tonic triad in first inversion. And same thing here, we have 1-6 going to 1 in the key of A major, but instead of getting a G sharp diminished chord, which actually for all intents and purposes is entirely intact, we have G sharp, B, and D here. But we do add the E to the chord, which turns a G sharp diminished triad into an E7 chord. So a 5-4-3 really is just a 7-6 chord with an E in the root. So 5-4-3 for all intents and purposes is a 7-6 chord, and we're seeing it bridged here. This is just a slight variation on it. But we are looking to modulate to the key of E major at some point. We have a passing tone in the bass here, and then we get E, E, G sharp, and B, with D sharp happening on the 8th note afterwards. So I reckon this is not only just a 5 chord, but also our tonic triad in the key of E major, E, E, G sharp, and B. And we also get, like I said, D sharp, that B is actually a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it, but this F sharp is not. We have D sharp, B, F sharp, and B, which is B major over D sharp. That's a passing 5/6 chord. So notice how pretty much on every and in this measure, Bach subdivides the chord progression with a 5 chord, and that's pretty cool. I'm sure that that's significant in a certain way. That seems a little too consistent to be coincidental. But we then get C sharp, E, and A, which is A major over C sharp. It's a 4/6 chord in the key of E major. A is a chord tone, E is a chord tone, G sharp is a passing 7th. And then we have B, E, and F sharp, this E being a 4/3 suspension over the bass. When we get the resolution, we introduce the 7th of the chord, so I'm going to call this 5/7 rather than 5. And then we get a perfect authentic cadence in the key of E major, where we cadence on 1, E, G sharp, B, and E. And then we have a proportionately longer phrase than the rest of the chorale, and there is a lot of harmonic activity here, and this took me quite some time to analyze. I could not quite center my ear on exactly what was happening at each point. I actually had to write out all of the chords, which is a really helpful thing to do if you're struggling with your own analysis. When you can't quite pinpoint a key, or when there's a lot of harmonic activity like you're going to be seeing through this analysis, and it's hard to follow along when you're doing the analysis, write out the chords. Spell out each chord that's happening or where you suspect a particular chord is happening, and see if you can derive some type of chord progression or map a key onto something. And then it helped me here. But what ends up happening here is there's a lot of elision. There's a lot of chords blending into chords, especially in the middle of the phrase here, at the end of the first complete measure and at the beginning of the second measure. But we start things off with a 4 chord. I think that we are in the key of E major going into this phrase, and then we briefly go to A major in a similar fashion that we saw a visitation to D major here in the previous phrase, or I guess the previous phrase. But starting things off, we have A, C sharp, and E. That's our 4 chord. This F sharp is a non-chord tone. This D is a non-chord tone. If we take an aggregate of everything, this is actually D sharp, carrying over from the previous phrase. D sharp, F sharp, A, and E. It's almost like we have the makings of a 7 chord here in passing, but we don't quite have the entirety of the chord. And when we're linking a 4 chord, especially to a tonic triad, 7 is a very common subdivided chord progression that Bach injects into the texture, but in this case it's not entirely intact, it's just mostly referenced. But our 4 chord does go to 1, G sharp, E, and B, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. Passing tone in the bass before we get E, A, F sharp, and B. Now I reckon this E is an accented non-chord tone. Not the first time we've seen we've seen a chord like this before. We saw a 5 chord referenced here as well, where the inner 8th notes were non-chord tones. This is a figure that we see in Bach from time to time. But this is B7 over D sharp, A, F sharp, and B, which is 5/6/5. And that goes exactly where we would expect it to, E major, E, G sharp, E, and B, which is our tonic triad, and where I believe we're going to the key of A major briefly, like I mentioned earlier. This is now our 5 chord. We also have a passing tone in the bass, and then we get a very interesting gesture from Bach. And it took me a while to sort of discern why we didn't go to the key of D major here, because it's very clear that this sounds like a progression in the key of D major. We have A7, we're going to eventually resolve to D major, but I think that because everything is happening so quickly, what makes a little bit more sense is that A major is the object here, because we would be modulating over a secondary dominant, which in contrast with some of my earlier videos, if you've watched some of my earlier videos, like in the first 60 episodes or so, you would find that I would regularly say that modulations were occurring over secondary dominants, and I've since walked back that line of thought. I think that a modulation where it can happen over a secondary dominant is not quite as common as I made it seem in my earlier videos. So in this case, even though we are moving to the key of A major as our tonic is actually functioning as a secondary dominant because we have this G natural here, but it very quickly reverses to this G sharp here. But by the time we get this G sharp introduced, we've already started making motions to the next key, which you might be able to see here highlighted in the alto, but we'll talk about it when we get there. So this A chord, it does feel like a tonic, but we have a flatted seventh in the bass, which means one thing. This is a secondary dominant, and it is 5/4-2 of 4. So 5 is still resolving to 1 in a sense, but this G natural in the bass changes the function of our 1 chord to a secondary dominant. It is now 5 of 4, which 1 also happens to be, except for in major keys. It requires the contextualization, or that extra context of adding that flatted seventh to illustrate that picture. This E is a chord tone, this G is a chord tone as well, and then we get D major, F sharp, A, F sharp, and D in first inversion. So this is like a 5/4-2 to 1/6 progression in terms of D major, but I'm fairly convinced that we're in the key of A major here. That's just what it sounds like to me. Melodically, it feels like at this point C sharp is rising to D, and eventually D is going to go back down to A. That's what it sounds like to me. It's very possible that we do briefly visit the key of D here, and what ends up happening is this A chord is just a byproduct of a chain of dominants. E is the dominant of A, which is the dominant of D. That's another possible outlook, but I don't know. To me, after trying to rationalize this chord progression and map it onto the chords that were happening, it makes sense that E is going to A, and A is just being used as a quick turnaround to then shift the focus to D. But I do think A is the object here. The melody does, the profile does actually kind of look like D major with a 6-7-1 going on, B, C sharp, D, but it just, with the rest of the context of everything going on, especially with the just the fact that E is resolving to A, but the G is psyching us out, I do think it's just an unusual progression, but it starts to make a little bit more sense moving forward, because this D major chord is now 6/6 in the key of F sharp minor. As you can see here, we're preparing for F sharp minor with D sharp, E sharp, F sharp going on in the bass. I would have said that we've modulated to F sharp minor earlier. However, this G natural is a little harder to justify in the key of F sharp minor, because we would expect G sharp in the key, and that would imply some type of Phrygian shenanigans, and I don't think that that's exactly what's happening. But after our 6/6 chord, we get a passing G sharp, or two of them, and an E and a C sharp as well. And this is where it gets very interesting, because we have a passing C sharp minor chord over G sharp. The fifth of the chord is doubled. That also is a little bit interesting. Not so much in a 6/4 chord, but this is a passing C sharp minor chord. I had to double check and see if this actually wasn't in E sharp, which is what I would expect it to be, but no, it's actually E natural. And with that being the case, this is a passing minor dominant in second inversion, and kind of in the same way that this 4/3 chord is bridging the gap between 1 and 1/6. This 6 chord is being bridged between, or at least the basses are being bridged between a 6 chord and a 6/4 chord. But on the other side of it, even though you could continue inverting this chord and say that this next chord could potentially be a 6/6/4 chord, it actually gets turned into a 4 chord. We have A, F sharp, D sharp, and B, which is B7 over A, or in other words, 4/4-2. Harmonization of the melodic minor scale. We would expect it to go to some type of first inversion chord afterwards, which it does. We have G sharp. This B is actually a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we have E sharp. So E sharp, G sharp, B, and B. This is E sharp diminished over G sharp, or 7/6. 4 wants to go to 7. 4/4-2 more specifically wants to resolve to 7/6. This is a good sign. And then we resolve to our tonic, F sharp minor, F sharp, C sharp, F sharp, and A, our tonic triad. And also coincidentally, where I do think we go back to the key of A major very briefly, at least that's what it sounds like to me. It sounds like we're moving to the key of A major, if anything, just for a couple of moments before we address what's going on here cadentially, which is still a little confusing, but I'm confident enough with an analysis to present it to you all. So we have A, now where this F sharp is now a 6 chord. This E is a passing 7th, this D is a non-chord tone, this G sharp is a non-chord tone, this B is a non-chord tone. That would make this a 5-7 chord, E7 in root position. And then we go to D, E, A, and C sharp, but this D is an accented non-chord tone. We get C sharp instead, C sharp, E, A, and C sharp, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. And now, this is where I think we briefly, or we end our brief visit to A major. You very easily could have analyzed this in the key of F sharp minor too, but it just doesn't quite sound like F sharp minor moving on from this point. I do think there's just a lot of rapid harmonic activity going on here. But yes, we are going to the key of D major here to close things out. This is now our 5-6 chord, and then we get a bit of a deceptive progression, or I guess a transitive progression might be a more accurate way to describe it. We get D sharp, F sharp, A, and B, which is B7 over D sharp. That's 5-6-5 of 2, just a substitution for B minor 7 over D. Raising the third of the 2 chord turns it into a major chord, and that becomes the dominant of 5. So 5 of 2 versus 5 of 2, versus 6 end up being the same chord, because B minor 7 would be our 6-7 chord. 5-6-5 of 2 is just turning that chord into a major triad as its foundation. But the chord does resolve where we expect it to. We get E, E, G, and B, which is our 2 chord in root position, passing 7th in the bass, naturalizing that D sharp, and then we get C sharp, E, G, and A, which is another 5-6-5 chord, A7 in first inversion. This A is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it, and then we get D, and then we're going to have to talk about this cadence. So D here, D, D, F sharp, and A, that is our tonic triad, and our final cadential chord is very, very interesting. We have A, D natural, F sharp, and A, which is taking our tonic triad and putting it in second inversion to start things off. Very unusual. Then we get C sharp and E, which is our 5 chord, A, C sharp, E, and A, which is A major. And then we have some embellishing tones here. This B is a neighbor tone, this D is a neighbor tone. Doesn't really contribute too much to the chord progression because it doesn't leave us with a chord that we can really analyze using Bach terminology. And then we have A major as our last chord, A, C sharp, E, and A, making this, in my opinion, some type of half cadence, but I think there's the argument to be made that there is some kind of imperfect authentic cadence idea going on here, because if you think the cadence ends right before our final measure, and the final measure is a codetta of sorts or some type of tag, I think those are both accurate outlooks on the chorale. But for me, because the ending does shift the focus to A, it makes it feel like a half cadence to me, and it's an unusual half cadence in the sense that A really feels like it's becoming a tonic, and with that being the case, one might even make the argument that this D going to A has the idea of a plagal cadence somewhat emerging from here, because D is the 4 of A, it's the subdominant. So if you view A as the tonic by the time the cadence finally comes around, you could say that we are now thinking in terms of A major, and D is a 4 chord resolving to our 1. So this is a very ambiguous cadence. I think we are in the key of D major, and this is a half cadence. But I think there are multiple outlooks and multiple arguments that make this cadence dynamic and have really a unique profile that we haven't seen before, which is always a very fascinating thing. But on that note, I think we're going to wrap up the analysis for today. All things considered, a very unusual chorale with no really unexpected chords. I mean, I guess we do have a minor dominant going on. Those are always fascinating. The fact that we have so many modulations going on in such close proximity to one another does leave me a little unsettled, because we would expect for Bach not to really do that, especially with little modulations that are only 2 or 3 beats long. Definitely uncommon. especially one here where I'm making the argument that we're going to the key of A major but don't even reference A major. All in all, very fascinating chorale. Definitely one to put in the back pocket for chains of dominance or unusual harmonies that are being chained with one another, and quick harmonic movement as far as the trajectory and the keys are concerned, but doing so with mostly expected chords, like chords that you would tend to see in your average chorale. But I think that's all that I want to say about this particular chorale. If you're interested in following me along on this journey to analyze all of the chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You could also hit the notification icon if you're interested in getting a daily notification about when my regular upload goes live. If you love Bach, if you like analysis, this is the place to be, and you'll be seriously supporting the channel by doing so. So I'd love to have you along on the journey. With all of that being said, thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you so much for supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.